I am, at heart, an academic. Beneath this goofy monster toy geek facade is a published nonfiction author with a graduate degree who has worked in museums for over a decade. I even have the misfortune of being one of the most frequently cited and misinterpreted authors on the subject of steampunk in cultural studies papers. So, other than experiencing firsthand how cultural studies types don't really understand what they're studying by being the misunderstood object of their study, I typically enjoy bridging the gap between a fan's appreciation for the technical aspects of a film and an academic's interest in deep thematic analysis. But there is perhaps no film for which Googling up academic papers is as pointless as the original 1933 King Kong. Almost to a one, they simply cannot resist expounding a singular opinion on a singular question. Is King Kong racist? The scholarly consensus on this subject is clear. Each new paper on King Kong reads like a summary of the last. Rather than expanding possible interpretations of the film, each analysis constrains it even more to a limited set of approved opinions. Each paper is a catalog of footnotes for every previous paper that said the exact same things. The argument that King Kong is a racist metaphor for black people in America is so constrained that NPR had to ask if it's even possible to make a King Kong movie that isn't racist. A summary that is just as good as any other comes by way of David Rosen from a 1975 issue of Jump Cut. It doesn't require too great an exercise of the imagination to perceive the element of race in King Kong. Racist conceptions of blacks often depict them as subhuman, ape, or monkey-like. And consider the plot of the film. Kong is forcibly taken from his jungle home, brought in chains to the United States, where he is put on a stage as a freak entertainment attraction. He breaks his chains and goes on a rampage in the metropolis, until finally he is felled by the forces of law and order. And indeed, it does not take too much imagination, as this is the dominant interpretation among scholars. But it does take some considerable leaps of imagination to provide any post hoc rationalization for this initial knee jerk reaction to the film. Often, these leaps of imagination run in direct contradiction to the actual contents of the film itself, as we shall see. So, is King Kong racist? Well, first we must disentangle what we mean with that question, because there are two different questions in there. What do you mean by asking if King Kong is racist? If you mean whether the film adopts numerous racist tropes and practices from 1930s Hollywood, then yes, it is. There's no escaping the caricature that is Charlie the Chinese cook, or the tribespeople of Skull Island sacrificing virgins. Yes, King Kong is situated in the tradition of pre-World War II ethnographic, colonialist, and jungle adventure film, alongside and in the wake of films like Tarzan the Ape Man, Trader Horn, Bird of Paradise, and copious documentaries, like Cooper's own Grass and Chang, that probe foreign lands and exoticize the other as a foil for Eurocentric self-actualization. King Kong is, in many ways, about that genre. It's not only a movie about white explorers who go off to some far-flung exotic land. It's a movie about white explorers who go off to some far-flung exotic land. It's a movie about ethnographic and colonialist film, and neither is it expressly critical of that genre, though we will discuss that later. In many ways, it is a satire of the genre. And if critiques stopped there, that would be fine. But it's hard to write paper after paper after paper as a rite of passage by revisiting how King Kong is not particularly any more racist than any other movie of the period. In fact, I think a case could be made that the caricatures of the Skull Islanders are relatively mild in comparison to the unrelenting ethnic stereotypes of actual ethnic groups in Bird of Paradise or The Mask of Fu Manchu. King Kong is racist, but no more racist than 1930s Hollywood adventure movies tended to be. So we get to the second meaning of the question. Is Kong himself a racist allegory for black people in America? The first and most obvious problem with this hypothesis is that Merian C. Cooper was definitely not seeing Kong as a metaphor for black people. That was not his wavelength. He was seeing Kong as a big scary monkey. King Kong did not begin conceptually with Cooper wanting to make an allegory for black people or a commentary on broad social issues. It began with him wanting to make a movie about gorillas fighting Komodo dragons. Describing their work together on the film Grass, Marguerite Harrison characterized Cooper as someone who was forever striving for startling climaxes and sharp contrasts, and for whom the human element was negligible, except insofar as it was needed for our picture. Getting to know Cooper in the 1960s, film scholar Rudy Belmer described him as a natural showman, most interested in those aspects of the movies which are the most cinematic: exotic locales, sweep and movement, special effects, advances in color reproduction, and the possibilities of the wide screen. Not a dealer in obscurities, in the complexities of human nature, nor in the contemporary scene. His work was bold or sentimental, but very seldom anything in between. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and a giant ape is just a giant ape. Sometimes spectacle exists for its own sake. A movie might exist simply as a spectacle, for the thrill of the spectacle. Willis O'Brien and Marcel Delgado, the effects team who brought Kong to life, actually wanted to humanize the monster and make him sympathetic. Cooper, on the other hand, simply wanted the spectacle of the most terrifying monster ever seen on screen. O'Brien and Delgado reached a compromise that still snuck not only humanized and sympathetic characteristics into Kong, but much of the personality of O'Brien himself. If Carl Denham is Cooper's self-insert, Kong is O'Brien's. That said, there is still a strong parallel between Carl Denham and King Kong as characters. Both are kings of their respective realms, titanic animating forces of their respective jungle islands, the concrete jungle of Manhattan and the primeval jungle of Skull Island. And both kidnap Ann Darrow. Kong may then be a hybrid of his creators, the team of O'Brien and Delgado, as well as Cooper. If Cooper even recognized that. In the press book, Cooper cites Kipling and Jack London's stories of humanized animals as the literary antecedents to Kong, which is a far more useful insight into what Kong is supposed to be than a presentist lens of postmodern racial politics. And Kong does become a sympathetic figure, not because he is a black allegory or a queer allegory or whatever is popular in cultural studies this week, but because he is an anthropomorphized animal. Big and scary, none of us would want to be in Ann Darrow's place, sure, but likewise, we still feel sorry for the big guy being ripped from his home and shot down over New York, because anyone who has ever seen a wildlife documentary knows that animals elicit human sympathy. As the owner of a store that sells monster toys, I can tell you that the creature from the Black Lagoon is by far the most popular Universal monster, with a story virtually identical to King Kong's across the film and its first sequel. I can guarantee, with almost 100% certainty, that nobody involved in making King Kong saw it as very much more than a big, dumb monster movie. Yes, they made it to resonate with its times, from the traditions of ethnographic, colonialist, and jungle adventure film to the Great Depression to a climax on the newest and tallest skyscraper in the world. But it was a resonance to accentuate the spectacle and the glamour of the thing. It was a concerted effort to make a film that was equally as fantastical and as timely as possible. We know that this was the simplicity of their approach because that's explicitly what they said it was. As King Kong became an object of postmodernist scholarship in the 60s and 70s, during the sexual revolution and the civil rights movement, Cooper was adamant that they were all reading more into the film than was actually there. According to Belmer again, Cooper became irate when we discussed those who attach symbolic overtones, phallic and otherwise, to various aspects of Kong. As far as he was concerned, there were no hidden meanings, psychological or cultural implications, profound parallels, or anything remotely resembling intellectual significance in his film. Sometimes a giant ape really is just a giant ape. Now, after the fact, we can look at King Kong in the traditions of the horror and adventure genres and make reasoned interpretations of it, careful in understanding that these are our own interpretations and not necessarily the authorial intent. We can infer interpretations like the things man was not meant to know, the chthonic and primitive subconscious forces of humankind, the power of nature, and the simultaneous tragedy and triumph of our subjugation of it, and other such abstract concepts that may or may not have subconsciously informed the creation of the film. I think these so-called timeless, abstract themes are a more fruitful avenue of discourse because it better fits the profile of what we know about how the movie was made. Cooper didn't set out to make a film about the Great Depression or about the 1920s nadir of race relations in the USA. According to a quote via Belmer, King Kong was escapist entertainment, pure and simple. But the idea of nature as a powerful unknown not to be trifled with may have been underlying Cooper's thought just from the sheer experience of adventuring around the world as a documentary filmmaker. Characters like Carl Denham and King Kong himself might represent aspects of their creators because the creators put themselves into their work. But if we can allow for those underlying abstract interpretations, why not the interpretation that King Kong is racist? Well, for one, accusations of racism carry a moral dimension. To call something racist is not merely to accept that it was written 80 years ago. It is to throw mud at it, and to anyone who likes it, despite its dated racial caricatures. Asserting that King Kong is a racist film is asserting that King Kong is a morally bad film. And that moralism has no more a place in the proper study and appreciation of film than the satanic panic of the 1980s had in the study and appreciation of popular music. And it's not like this film is Birth of a Nation or Triumph of the Will, which were explicit propaganda for racist movements. We're talking about a movie that some people feel is racist because that's how they chose to interpret it. The movie itself is not about the KKK or the Nazis. It's about a giant ape fighting dinosaurs and running amok in New York. Now, that moralism necessarily involves a presentist perspective. It involves looking back at this work from 80 years ago with modern values and sensibilities, imposing upon it modern lenses of interpretation that didn't exist back then, modern political views, and thereby declaring it and anyone who likes it to be morally bad people. I don't think it's an accident that racialized and psychosexual interpretations of King Kong proliferated with the civil rights movement and sexual revolution. Moralism privileges a modern reception of the film, modern feelings about the film, over what it actually is. Now, this approach to film is called reception theory, and it is the biggest problem with academic study of King Kong. Reception theory is the study of how a book, movie, or other piece of media is received by the audience, and how the audience make their own meaning from the text, based on their own individual cultural background and life experiences. It asserts that the derivation of meaning is a negotiation between the text and the audience, rather than solely the intent of the text creators. In other words, it is the study about how people feel about a movie, rather than what the movie actually is. This is the antithesis of the approach that I have heretofore taken, which privileges authorial intent and a close reading of the film. Close reading is the study of what the movie actually is, what actually happens in it, what it actually says, the actual intent and inspirations of the people who made it. In other words, what is actually true. Now, close reading is, of course, considered problematic and anti-democratic, because it asserts that the scholar perpetrating the close reading has declared themselves an authority on the meaning of the film. But, well, that's true. They are. A person who has studied the film closely is more of an authority over someone who has not. Everyone is entitled to an opinion, but not everyone is entitled to their opinion being valid. That's how reality works. And that fact is far less problematic than reception theory as a whole. Because technically speaking, reception theory doesn't even study the film. It studies the audience's psychological reaction to the film, and then projects that reaction onto the film itself. It is the study of an audience's feelings. But as countercultural as it is for me to say this, there is no logical and necessary reason to believe that someone's feelings correlate to an objective, exterior reality. Besides being narcissistic, this can cause irrevocable damage to people's ability to properly assess the film. Now, lest you think I'm merely panicking over something that doesn't happen, I've literally had that discussion with people who have been taught to see the film only this way, only through this one presentist lens, who decide that it's racist and offensive, and therefore refuse to look at it any deeper or to question if that lens is wrong. And by lacking the presence of mind to question itself, much of Kong scholarship is self-revealing. I would even describe it as a self-own. As in, scholars put this out there, not realizing that they're just humiliating themselves in doing so. Namely, if you look at a giant ape running amok in New York and you automatically think black people, that's on you. That's your problem. You're the racist. You're the racist who sees black people symbolically represented in giant bloodthirsty apes. And you're displacing your racism onto the film, blaming it for making you think that, when you have nobody to blame but yourself. I didn't see King Kong as a symbolic black person. You did. Now, if you are a black person, and you look at a giant ape running amok in New York, and you see yourself in it, well, I don't know what to tell you. You don't have to see it that way. But you also don't need me to tell you that either. This discourse on King Kong hinges on the automatic acceptance of the assumption that a gorilla figure is meant to be associated with black men, simply because this assumption was assumed, with no further reflection on whether this assumption is actually true, reinforced by mechanisms of social stigma to shame disagreement. Questioning if something is racist, to question someone's feeling that racism has been perpetrated against them, is itself considered racist. Ironically, it becomes racist to look at a giant ape running amok in New York and not think black people, because you are perceived as denying someone's experience of racism by not receiving the film the same way they did. Faced with this obvious and crippling flaw that their interpretation of King Kong is based on nothing more than their feelings being hurt by the racist caricatures populating their own heads, scholars have attempted post hoc rationalizations by cherry-picking moments from the film that they believe support their claims. Now, cherry-picking is the antithesis of an actual close reading. One of the worst examples of this kind of cherry-picking comes from one of the most recent scholarly articles, King Kong, the Black Gorilla, by Juan Roche Carcel, professor of sociology at the University of Alicante in Spain, published in Quarterly Review of Film and Video in 2021. Now, first of all, to set the stage, Roche Carcel's curriculum vitae is a mixed assortment of papers on urban sociology and plastic art. His body of work is not even in film studies, let alone 1930s horror, adventure, and ethnographic film. Every few years, though, he publishes a paper on King Kong, none of which are any better than this one. Now, I don't know him personally, but I have a feeling that his interest in Kong comes from an urban studies perspective, Kong climbing the skyscraper, than from actually being a fan, to his detriment. His descriptions of the horror and adventure genres are as dry as any you would get from an academic paper written by other academics who aren't fans either. Now, I understand that an academic brings different concerns into studying film than does a fan, and the fan is the better for it. But one could at least hope for more than a passing familiarity with the relevant genres. A cardinal rule of skepticism is to beware experts outside their area of expertise. A fan is always more of an expert on a film they like than an academic is, because a fan is most likely to have steeped in a close reading of the text and the genre. So, without understanding the subject, or as we will see, understanding objective reality, Roche Carcel engages in some of the most egregious cherry-picking I've ever seen. I had a good laugh over one of the news articles covering his paper. The headline read, "Study reveals that the film King Kong is loaded with racism." And the article went on to say, "The analysis and results have just been published in the scientific article, King Kong, the Black Gorilla, in the Quarterly Review of Film and Video." Applying terms like study and scientific and analysis and results is very generous to what is little more than an opinion piece that is so thoroughly devoid of rigor that it never should have passed editorial review to begin with. Some examples. Roche Carcel complains repeatedly about the presentation of New York in the 1930s as hegemonically white, absent of people of color. Rather than situate that in the practices of white-dominated 1930s Hollywood, he singles it out in this film as symbolic of cities being the domain of white people, being intruded upon by this image of the black migrant. Well, here's an interesting fact. In 1930, the population of Manhattan was 95.08% non-Hispanic white. So there's that. Roche Carcel asserts that there is a racial dimension to why, in the West's collective unconscious, the color black symbolizes evil, sin, misery, famine, war, and death. I wonder if there is any other reason, perhaps an evolutionary one, why cultures around the world associate the color black with danger. Early on in the paper, he draws parallels between Manhattan and Skull Island. But despite these obvious divergences between the two worlds, the film also connects them with a series of similarities or correspondences that, in the end, relativize these differences. Among these are the sacrifice/the show, the snake/subway, the mountain/skyscraper, and the pterodactyl/biplanes. Good insight. I wonder what book he got it out of. However, he cites the patriarchal and colonial system that generates this genre as distinguishing New York and Skull Island from each other. In this sense, it is not gratuitous that if New York manifests good, history, progress, reason, the center, civilization, and the white, Skull Island embodies death, evil, prehistory, the primitive, irrationality, the margin, barbarism, and the black. Except there's no reason to make the assumption that the concrete jungle of Manhattan, with its Great Depression, soup kitchens, and hungering people, is good and rational and civilized, and therefore ideologically white. Denham even begins with the case that it's more dangerous for women in New York than on his expeditions, immediately before he goes out and basically kidnaps Anne. Roche-Carcel attempts to argue that New York represents the contemporary environment of progress, science, technology, and civilization, since when the Venture ship leaves New York in the direction of Skull Island, it is daytime. The city buildings are illuminated, and the smoke from the chimney is white. Or it's easier to film Manhattan from the water during the daytime, and steam is white. And that's not the Venture in his example photo either. And this is literally the first time we see Manhattan during the day. Every scene up to this moment has been at night. Nor should we forget that the first time we actually see Skull Island is also during the day. I wonder if there are technical reasons for that. One of my favorite passages for the flaws in Roche-Carcel's reading of the film is this one. Thus, he is the symbol of the gorillas that live in the city, not for nothing when he is taken to the New York theater to be exhibited before a white, bourgeois, too refined, consumerist cowed audience with a cannibalistic and racist vision of the gorilla. A blonde lady comments, "There are not enough gorillas in New York to introduce us to another one?" The truth is that he is a gigantic animal that walks upright, as if he were a human. A hybrid figure, a human beast, which threatens the taboo of interracial sex, since it must have an enormous penis and a corresponding disproportionate sexual potency. We already have, then, all the ingredients to relate sexism to racism, as will be seen in the next section, and also the latter, as I have just done to politics and economics. But those men referred to as gorillas were white. Big, burly, brutish, uncouth white guys. It was a slight against the uncouthness of New Yorkers, another tongue-in-cheek parallel between Skull Island and Manhattan. And would it be gauche of me to point out that gorillas don't have large penises? Like, proportionately, human penises are massive compared to the penises of other primates? Would it have killed Roche-Carcel to have Googled gorilla penises? It's especially weird that he didn't, given that he has a fixation on penises. In the paper, he has the shocking audacity to argue that white women fantasize about having surprise sex with black men, and therefore Kong represents a giant, black, rapacious penis. Dude. On page 14, he asserts that the threat of Kong as a symbol of blackness involves terrorizing white citizens, breaking their bodies, biting them, etc. Then on pages 31 and 32, he suggests that Kong appeals to stereotypes of black people as cannibals, illustrated with a photo of Kong eating one of the black villagers. Very equal opportunity. He cites Kong climbing the Empire State Building as a symbol of black people's social ascent, which in turn needs to be cut down and punished, including a head-shaking example of unnecessary verbosity, that Kong sinks abruptly to ground level. You mean he fell? Roche-Carcel completely ignores the cultural factors of the Empire State Building being the newest and tallest skyscraper in the world. Tom Cruise climbing the Burj Khalifa. Actually, no, hold up, no. I don't want to give him any ideas for more papers. I could keep going. At this point, I might just be mean and picking on the poor scholar as one of the rabble of mere ignorant fanboys. I think I made my point that King Kong scholarship is mired in reception theory, out of context and misrepresented snippets from the film, creatively applied to bolster the most tenuous and frankly absurd possible interpretations, which fall apart with the slightest close reading and the all too frequent exclamation of, "What?" If evidence for your case is based on not knowing that steam is white, or that gorillas have tiny penises, or that Manhattan was actually 95% white, or that your interpretation of events in the film is literally the opposite of what actually happened in it, what case do you have left? Well, you just have a bunch of shit you made up in your own head. Now, here's the thing, I am neither ignorant nor unsympathetic of the trade that King Kong makes in the tropes and images of 1930s Hollywood jungle adventure movies. There was a stock in these images that had come to represent exotic fascination for audiences of the Great Depression, as well as the later surrealists and modern primitivists who would embrace King Kong in the decades to come. It's the going beyond those, to invent whole cloth an alternate history of the movie that ignores much of the movie's actual development history, its actual promotions, and even its actual contents. This alternate history even misses some critical aspects of the medium itself. Now, it's rather astonishing how often cultural critics don't understand the medium of the thing they're critiquing. Some years ago, there was a cultural critic who did a trade in critiquing the place of women in video games, and one of her most common criticisms was that female non player characters lacked agency. You know, the princess was always someone for Mario to rescue, and not a developed character with her own hopes and aspirations. But it's a video game. The only person in a video game with agency is the player, by definition. That's how a game works. Likewise, movies are a medium that have certain features and constraints of its own, which can be revealed by a close reading. For example, Roche Carcel points out that Anne is a much feistier character than the quiet, demure, pliant Bride of Kong. Not to mention the striking visual difference between them, and fair enough. Jungle adventure movies did utilize the trope of the Caucasian woman's physical difference from African women, imbuing it with some kind of near divine status. That was a trope. I'll add here, though, as an aside, that I literally know people personally who have been to Africa and whose long, straight blonde hair was a source of novelty and fascination for the communities they visited. So that does happen in real life. Now, that said, there is also a visual narrative reason for this trope. The character of Anne is as different from the Skull Islanders as possible in order to quickly telegraph Kong's fascination with her. Fay Wray herself is a natural brunette. She was given a wig for her role as Anne. This same process acts at the beginning of the film, when the golden-haired Anne is meant to stand out from the homely brunettes in line for the New York soup kitchen. She is a novelty on either island. Roche Carcel also makes inferences about the fact that we know Anne as a feisty character, whereas we only know the Bride of Kong as a silent extra. Now, in-universe, one could point out that Anne is rather new to this whole ceremony of being sacrificed to Kong. The Bride of Kong is not. She's seen this before. She's grown up with this. She's probably seen Kong before from the wall's ramparts. No wonder that Anne is screaming her head off, while the Bride of Kong is in fearful but silent compliance. But there is also a narrative reason for this difference. Anne is the character. One of the principal characters, in fact. We're supposed to get to know her. And yes, getting to know her does set her apart for us as the audience, which shorthands how different she is to Kong from his usual diet of brides. We also don't know anything about the white sailors who fall to their deaths. My point is, many of these academic appraisals by culture critics, sociologists, and anybody but actual fans of the thing are shockingly superficial, despite their verbosity and voluminous footnotes. It all comes down to the most superficial possible reading of the film. Racists sometimes compare black people to monkeys, and King Kong is a giant monkey. Therefore, he must be a symbolic black person. That's it. That's literally all the argument is. Now, had any of these scholars been more than a mere scholar, and actually been a fan of these films and these genres, They might have been steeped enough in them to recognize certain other tropes. Allow me to provide an example to close out this video. A critical error that many scholars make is missing the potency of wonder at the mystery of the unknown and the other. They automatically assume that something other is something bad, and that is not necessarily the case, especially in the conventions of 1930s horror. The exotic is an object of fascination for anybody. I mean, I already mentioned the person I literally know whose exotic blonde hair was a source of fascination for people she met in Africa. This exoticism is usually perceived by critics to be an attack on the exoticized subject. But there's no automatic reason to think that. The entire Tarzan series of films is based on the exotic as a critique of civilization, the escape from civilization to a more primal, exciting, sexually fulfilling, and honest way of life. Furthermore, in horror conventions, primitive, quote unquote, and marginal peoples on the edge of the unknown are the bulwark against the dangers of the unknown. The Transylvanian villagers in Dracula, the gypsies in the Wolfman, even Dr. Mueller in The Mummy are wisdom keepers of esoteric traditions that respect and guard against the unknown, the evil, and or the semi-divine. Then in come the characters from Civilization, insulated from the dangers of the unknown by modernity, who stumble through these bulwarks of so-called superstition and unleash dark, dangerous, chthonic forces on civilization. An ignorant young archaeologist insists that a few thousand years is enough time to take the mumbo-jumbo off any old curse, and unleashes the mummy on modern Cairo. Renfield does not heed the warnings of the villagers and becomes a slave to Dracula, whom he brings to London. Larry Talbot ignores the gypsy warnings, goes galumphing into the dark forest, and becomes a werewolf. The Skull Islanders of King Kong can very easily be understood in the same light. While we might question their practice of human sacrifice, they know what Kong is. They maintain the wall. They know what not to mess with. But in come the ignorant filmmakers, who end up unleashing Kong on New York. Scholars like to theorize about King Kong's themes of technological supremacy over nature, and I wonder if they watched the same movie I did. The planes were a last-ditch attempt to stop a monster that the Skull Islanders successfully kept contained since time immemorial. The othering of these marginal societies may be caricatured, but it's not automatically vilifying. These groups are society's bulwark, society's defense from chaos. These are primal societies from which more so-called advanced society has evolved, whose modernity has distanced and insulated them from primal chaos and the threat it poses, which these primal societies are all too well acquainted with. Society is meant to protect us from this primal chaos, and any society that forgets why it exists is doomed to collapse. When the gypsies warn you about werewolves, listen. When the Transylvanian villagers give you a crucifix to protect you from Dracula, wear it. And please, please don't interrupt the ceremonies on Skull Island. Coming in the wake of World War I, and in the throes of the Great Depression, horror movies were ultimately a challenge to the so-called advanced civilizations. There are dark, chthonic forces we have built society to shield us from. Forget why, and we unleash something more horrifying than any Dracula, Frankenstein monster, Wolfman, or King Kong. Now, I have adopted a fairly dismissive tone towards modern academia and modern scholarship concerning King Kong, so I wanted to end by clarifying that I meant to be dismissive. Most academic scholarship on King Kong, comes across like some absurdist, dadaist art project by creeps and perverts. I may be accused of being anti intellectual and dismissing it thusly, but it's the other way around. I'm too intellectual to accept that a person's feelings reflect an exterior objective reality. I do think that reception theory is interesting as a psychological study. Reception, feelings are important and revealing for the psychological state of the person whose feelings they are. If a group identifies with King Kong and chooses to use him as a symbol for some aspect of their experience, that's an interesting insight into the group, not the film. If someone looks at King Kong and sees a giant symbolic black penis running amok through New York, it might be worth interrogating why they feel that. But that's never the approach that these academics take. Their methodology assumes that some emotional state, some reception, some psychological condition of their own reflects an objective exterior reality, which is an infantile way of viewing the world. I mean, quite literally, it is literally infantile. One of the most important signifiers in adolescent development is when a child learns to lie. For the first couple years of their life, a child does not perceive an exterior world outside of their own self. Everything is an extension of their needs, their feelings, and their mind. Learning to lie is critically important because it shows that they have learned that there is an exterior world outside of themselves, with exterior minds to their own. They have learned that other people have their own minds, and they know things that the child does not, and that the child knows things that other people do not. That is the basis upon which lying becomes possible. Academics studying King Kong seem to have been arrested at this pre-kindergarten stage of development. They see a giant symbolic black penis running amok in New York, and rather than go see a psychiatrist, they blame the movie for making them think that. They think it reflects an objective reality present in the film itself. They can't even conceive of external realities like steam being white, or the color black being associated with evil because nighttime is dangerous, or that characters in a film are scared of the giant monkey because giant monkeys are scary. They see everything on screen as a projection of their own somewhat diseased minds, rather than having any objective rationale of its own. Then they dress up this arrested development as reception theory and believe themselves privileged to some special gnosis that escapes fans who actually like the movie, who they proceed to project their own racism onto. Fans are racist because they don't see Kong as a giant symbolic black penis. But I can never stress this enough. If you watch King Kong and you see a giant symbolic black penis running amok in New York, that is your problem. That's not my problem. And that's not the movie's problem. That is your problem. And yours alone.